the ranking member had a vote in financial services, so we're going to get started as soon as she gets here. So we'll be starting up shortly. Committee will come to order. Good afternoon, and thank you all for being here. And a special thanks to our witness, IRS Commissioner Koskinen, who has taken time out away from his very busy schedule during an especially busy week. We're 2 days before April 15th, so we appreciate him being with us here today. And by the way, my wife and I filed our taxes several weeks ago, timely, so we're legal. Earlier today, our subcommittee on economic growth, tax, and capital access heard from a panel of small businesses and experts who serve the small business community. And we hear from small business folks all the time. We hear from individuals, from folks all over the country who repeatedly tell us that the tax code is just too complicated. People want to obey the law. However, the tax code gets more and more complicated every year, and it makes it harder and harder for small companies to get it right and to take full advantage of provisions designed to help them. The complexity of our tax laws steals valuable resources, both time and money, from these businesses. It hinders their ability to grow, succeed, and create the jobs we need. Making the tax code simpler is particularly important for American small business owners, as they are disproportionately affected by tax complexity. The GAO testified before this committee in July of last year that small businesses with 1 to 5 employees face an estimated tax compliance burden of more than $4,000 annually per employee. The problem is a combination of substantive and administrative complexity, meaning that not only is the law itself complicated, but the entire process of compliance is complicated as well. Tax laws alone come in at close to 3,000 pages. Regulations promulgated by the IRS add at least another 9,000 pages. And when you add in case law, the total increases exponentially up to around 70,000 pages. Our country's small businesses just can't keep up. We need to get our tax code working for small businesses instead of against them. That's what we're here to talk about today. And we look forward to hearing the Commissioner's ideas, as well as our members, on how we can work together on this. This committee takes seriously its responsibility to listen to America's small businesses and to work with them to make the tax code simpler, and easier to understand. Again, we want to thank Commissioner Koskinen for joining us here today, and I would now like to yield to the ranking member, Ms. Velasquez, for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Commissioner, for being here today. And this is a very valuable hearing which follows up on the subcommittee session from this morning. During that event, small businesses testified about the challenges they face in complying with the American Tax Code and its regulations. It is my hope that during this hearing, we can get perspective on what the IRS is doing to address this problem and what steps Congress can take to improve the situation. Make no mistake, the complexity of our tax code makes complying with the law more difficult and expensive, and that burden hits America's entrepreneurs hardest. Individuals and businesses spend 6.1 billion hours annually complying with the filing requirements of the code. These efforts constitute $163 billion in costs, with nearly a third of small businesses reporting that they spend more than 80 hours each week on tax compliance. It is clear, simply, adhering to tax laws is a challenging and expensive undertaking. At the same time that tax compliance is becoming increasingly complex and expensive, it appears some services from the IRS meant to provide businesses with assistance are being reduced. During the 2015 tax season, the IRS answered a little over one-third of telephone call inquiries, with an average wait time of 47 minutes. Half of written correspondence to the agency is not responded to within 90 days of being received. If, as the saying goes, time is money, this can only be a further drain on entrepreneurs' resources. Of course, these statistics on wait time and response rates are not meant only to criticize the IRS. The agency has a daunting challenge, especially this time of the year, and it is important that Congress provide the resources the IRS needs to serve all taxpayers, especially small firms. These challenges bring us to something that everyone on this committee likely agrees upon: the importance and value in reforming our tax code. Of course, doing so will be a significant undertaking, and the devil will be in the details, but a successful tax reform that simplifies the code will give small businesses greater certainty and allow them to spend their time and resources on what they do best: launching new products and creating new jobs in their local communities. There have been areas of progress that suggest we may be able to find other common ground in reforming the tax code. This committee was particularly supportive of making permanent a number of tax extenders, such as the R&D tax credit and Section 179 expensing. Making these changes permanent gave small businesses the certainty that they will be able to utilize these provisions in coming years, allowing them to plan for the future. As we look forward, there are areas that I hope tax reform will eventually tackle. As just one example, many small businesses struggle to track and comply with different state tax laws. For firms with employees who travel to multiple states, this can create a tangle of different rules to contend with. Likewise, the proliferation of online sales has raised issues about sales tax concerns. Bringing uniformity to these rules could help small firms and the self-employed harness the internet to reach new customers and markets. Mr. Chairman, I think all of us on both sides of the aisle and the Commissioner understand the vast array of tax compliance challenges facing entrepreneurs. The difficulty for us will be identifying viable solutions we can all get behind and hopefully implement. This will not be an easy task, but I do hope there is room down the road for cooperation and progress. In that regard, I thank the witness greatly for testifying and adding his perspective to this conversation. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back. And if members have opening statements prepared, we'd ask that they be submitted for the record. And Mr. Commissioner, I'd like to explain very briefly our rules relative to timing. You get 5 minutes. We get 5 minutes each individually. There's a lighting system. The yellow light lets you know that you've got a minute to wrap up. Red light, you're supposed to stop, but since we only have one witness, if you need a little extra time, we'd be more generous than normal. So we're happy if you do have a little bit more to say. And I'll now like to introduce our principal and only witness here this afternoon. We're pleased to be joined by the IRS Commissioner, John Koskinen. Mr. Koskinen is the 48th Commissioner of the IRS. He began his tenure in December 2013, and his term expires in November 2017. Prior to his most recent government service, Mr. Koskinen joined the Palmieri Company, which specialized in turnaround management and served as the president and CEO. He also served as the non-executive chairman of the board for Freddie Mac. He was deputy mayor and city administrator for the District of Columbia. And earlier, he was deputy director for management at the Office of Management and Budget. And perhaps most importantly, he has an Ohio connection, having been, I believe, born in Cleveland.
In Cleveland.
And his first job, I believe, was with the Cleveland News, not running the paper, but delivering it. And he has that in common with our director of this committee, Mr. Kevin Fitzpatrick, although his first job was delivering for the Cleveland Plain Dealer. So we got something in common here. Mr. Koskinen holds a BA in physics from Duke University and a law degree from Yale. And we're very honored to have you here today, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, Chairman Chabot, Ranking Member Velasquez, and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss with you the IRS's ongoing efforts in the area of small business tax simplification. The IRS recognizes the critical role small businesses play in our country as engines of economic growth, and we want to do our part to help them flourish. We don't have a direct role in tax law simplification, since tax policy is the domain of the Congress, the White House, and the Treasury Department, but the IRS can and does contribute to tax simplification in important ways. They include simplifying tax forms and notices, streamlining policies and procedures, providing regulatory relief, easing record-keeping requirements, and abating penalties wherever appropriate. We rely on feedback from a variety of sources in the tax industry and in the small business community to help us determine what actions we can take that would be most helpful. Let me give you a few examples of recent actions we've taken to help small businesses. We increased an expensing threshold so small businesses can take immediate deductions on more items they buy for business and avoid having to expense these items over many years. This was in response to feedback that the old threshold was too low to allow for things like personal computers, smartphones, machinery, and equipment parts. We set up a voluntary compliance program offering penalty relief to certain small business owners who failed to file annual retirement plan returns after we found that many owners didn't realize they had a filing requirement. We streamlined the process for small organizations applying for tax-exempt status, creating a 3-page application they can use instead of the full 26-page application. And we developed a simplified method for claiming the home office deduction to make it possible for more home-based businesses to take advantage of that tax break. While the IRS works to provide top-quality service to small business taxpayers, we also must carry out a robust enforcement program. Enforcing the tax laws helps maintain a level playing field for all businesses. It ensures that small business owners who comply with the law and pay the taxes they owe are not disadvantaged by others who may be cutting corners. One major focus of our enforcement efforts involves employment taxes. In many cases, actions taken to improve enforcement can also help taxpayers and increase voluntary compliance. An excellent example is our new employment tax early interaction initiative, which was launched last December. Under this initiative, we identify employers who appear to be falling behind on their employment tax obligations and offer them helpful information and guidance. That way, the problem can be corrected before unpaid taxes accumulate and we have to assess penalties. We're also working to make sure that small business owners are not defrauded when they outsource their tax obligations to payroll service providers. While most of these providers do a good job, businesses sometimes can fall prey to unscrupulous providers that abscond with their payroll tax deposits. We continue looking for ways to protect employers from these criminals and to provide assistance when fraud does occur. Our efforts to continuing assisting small business taxpayers are challenged by the difficult budget environment we're in. The IRS's funding was cut significantly for the 5 years from 2011 to 2015, and those reductions have taken a toll in both taxpayer service and enforcement programs. Therefore, we urge the Congress to approve the President's fiscal 2017 budget for the IRS, which requests an increase of about $1 billion over 2016, which would bring the agency's funding back up to the level of almost 7 years ago and would help the IRS across a wide range of tax enforcement and tax service categories. Along with providing adequate funding, Congress also has another important role to play by passing proposals to simplify tax administration for small business. The President's fiscal 2017 budget has a number of proposals in this area, and these include increasing the Section 179 expensing limit, allowing new businesses to deduct more startup costs, and improving the small business health care tax credit. Chairman Chabot, Ranking Member Velasquez, members of the committee, this concludes my statement, and I'd be happy to answer your questions. And yield back my 28 seconds.
Excellent. Well done. Thank you very much. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. Last May, the IRS discovered a data breach that exposed the data from approximately 700,000 accounts. What's the IRS done since that time to secure taxpayer data, and how can small businesses be assured going forward that their data is safe with the IRS?
The application that was hacked into was our Get Transcript application, which allows taxpayers or allowed taxpayers to get copies of previous year's tax returns. So the hack wasn't into our basic database, so that basic taxpayer information was not let go. What it represented was a problem we have of identity theft, dealing with increasingly sophisticated criminal syndicates around the world who had information already, not from the IRS, that allowed them to masquerade as the taxpayer. They knew Social Security numbers, names, addresses, and they could answer successfully, in some of the cases, out-of-wallet questions that the taxpayer should have been the only one who knew. So we took the application down, and we are testing now a much more secure application to protect that application and our ongoing future state, as we call it, as people deal with us more and more online. It's the same challenge financial institutions have. The challenge we have is, as you get the protection better to keep criminals out, it makes it more difficult for taxpayers to get in. Even under the old system, 22% of taxpayers couldn't answer their out-of-wallet questions and get access online to the transcript. But we are concerned about it for small businesses as well as individuals. A lot of small businesses really file as individuals. And we think that as we try to give people better service so that when they would like to, they can deal with us online, we need to make sure that that's secure. We need to have taxpayers feel comfortable that the data and the information they provide us is going to be protected.
Thank you. Were you able to determine who these people were, or that were able to hack in there?
These were clearly, as we tracked them down, criminal syndicates from foreign countries, primarily Eastern Europe. And as we've had our systems get attacked. And I asked our CTO if this is the right number, and he said it's actually worse than that, but nobody believes it. We have 1 million attacks a day on our system trying to probe and get into it. And in one of the systems where we caught people trying, as we shut them down, you could see the attacks move from country to country. So it is a much more sophisticated enemy than we've ever had to deal with before.
Okay. Thank you. Can you tell us about the future state and how it will help small businesses comply with the tax code?
Yeah, we've been working kind of toward the future state for the last 10 or 12 years, but we've pulled it together now in that framework of the future state. Of the future state, what we say is, what should the taxpayer experience be? Rather than looking at it from our standpoint, what should the taxpayer, what can we do to help taxpayers? And again, it's focused on primarily individuals and small businesses filing as individuals, and the goal is, our surveys show the vast majority of taxpayers would rather deal with us online than have to call or show up in person. And so the goal is to move as many of our interactions with taxpayers as we can into an online relationship, much like the online relationship you have with your financial institution or your bank today, where people pay bills by online, they make transactions online. And so for small businesses especially, it would be possible for them not only to file online, but if they had we had questions or issues, we would be able to send them a secure message. They could make the correction without having to file an amended return, and it would be much more efficient for them. But I would stress, we recognize we have an obligation to all taxpayers, and there will always be some taxpayers who either don't have access to online digital equipment or aren't comfortable online, who will want to deal with us on the phone and in person. And so we'll always provide those services. But as I say, if we can get people off the phone who would rather not be on the phone, then our phone service and our in-person service will be that much better.
Thank you. I think I've got time for one more question. You mentioned in your written testimony the tension between providing taxpayer service and tax liability enforcement. What specific steps are you taking to work with small businesses constructively earlier in the process to ensure voluntary compliance rather than having to resort to enforcement action?
We spend a significant amount, probably I had somebody add it up for me, we spend about 40% of our budget trying to help taxpayers, provide taxpayer service, because the vast majority of taxpayers want to be compliant. So the message we're trying to put out is if you're trying to be compliant, we really want to work with you. You don't have to hire somebody off late night TV to deal with us. If you're trying to be compliant, we have online installment agreements, we have offers in compromise, we have a lot of different ways to try to help people be compliant, and especially those who are having difficulties. As I said on our tax deposit initiative, it's designed to counsel with small businesses before they get farther behind, because oftentimes when it's tempting to, if you're having trouble, to say, well, I'll hold off on my federal tax deposit until later. Well, if you hold off too long, the number gets to be far beyond what you can control. So it's kind of a combination of enforcement and taxpayer service. Our thought was, in this pilot we're now trying to say, if we reach out to you quickly and say, hey, you know, you should be careful because it's going to get to be more of a problem, even though we usually don't talk to you until the end of the year, our experience is that taxpayers will then make sure they're paying attention to it and will be able to nip it in the bud, and so they won't have a compliance problem. So wherever we can, it's in our interest, and I think in the taxpayers' interest, to try to figure out how can we make it as easy and straightforward as possible for people to figure out what they owe and how to pay it.
Thank you very much. My time's expired. The ranking member, gentlelady from New York, Ms. Velasquez, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner, this morning we heard this from a small business about the complexity of the tax forms. And he suggested that the forms be written in plain language so that any small business taxpayers can understand. Is the IRS considering any such changes to forms or a way to help translate forms for taxpayers?
Well, it's going back to my last answer, it's a critical part of what we do. I say, having only been here for about 2.5 years, if you go back about 5 years and look at our website, it was a terrific website if you were a lawyer and liked to read tax regulations. It didn't help you very much if you were someone just trying to find answers. So we've written and continue to rewrite the vast amount of information on that website. We actually won a plain writing award a couple of years ago because we do think that that's a fair comment, that wherever we can, we sometimes have to get the lawyers out of the way. We need to be able to write the forms and the instructions in language that the average person can understand so they can be compliant.
Have you taken any steps to gather input from these stakeholders regarding online self-help?
Yes, actually we do surveys. The Restructuring Act of 1998 requires us to do surveys of taxpayers, so we do surveys, but we also meet regularly with the Chamber of Commerce, the National Federation of Independent Businesses, and others to try to get their views of what are the biggest obstacles they're facing, what is it we could do to be more helpful. Again, increasingly, more and more individuals and companies are doing their business online, and to the extent that they could deal with us online and file taxes and communicate with us, the feedback we get from them is it would be much better for them if we could do more of that.
In its 2015 report to Congress, the Taxpayers Advocate highlighted the need to bring taxpayer service to the small business owner. It found that the needs of populations that are geographically clustered in certain regions are often neglected due to the more centralized structure of the IRS. In fact, the report pointed out that there's no outreach staff dedicated to small business and self-employed taxpayers in 13 states and D.C. Does the IRS have any immediate plans to provide increased local assistance for these type of small businesses?
Yes, we think, again, one of the advantages of developing more and more online services for taxpayers is that it will make it easier for them wherever they are. We're also developing virtual service delivery, so in areas where we don't have a walk-in center, we're talking preliminarily with the Social Security Department agency, which has offices all around, where you could go in, and with a television monitor, you could actually, sort of like Skype, talk with an IRS person to person, even if they weren't physically there. So
And what about those who have no access online?
and if they don't have any, the virtual service delivery doesn't require online. It actually, you would go to the office and you would actually communicate directly with an IRS employee who can answer your questions, provide you service. The fact that they weren't sitting there physically with you wouldn't make much difference because you'd be talking with them wherever they happen to be located. And we think that technology would be available to people in rural areas and areas that otherwise are underserved.
Okay. The IRS budget has been cut by 18% since 2010, which in turn weakens your ability to provide customer assistance and collect critical revenue. In cutting the budget, some experts claim the government is foregoing more than $5 billion each year. How could an adequate budget improve small business taxpayers' compliance?
Well, an adequate budget, first of all, our taxpayer service this year is much better than last year as a
Sure.
result of the additional funding we appreciate we got from Congress. And I think it demonstrates the algorithm. If we had more funds, the service would get better. On the same side, on the enforcement side, we're down about a little over 5,000 revenue agents, officers, and criminal investigators since 2010. If you have 5,000 fewer people, you're going to do fewer audits. And on the one hand, some people say, well, that would be fine, but if you're a legitimate taxpayer and you're a legitimate businessman, a small businessman, if your competitor isn't paying their taxes, they're going to offer services or goods at a lower price. They'll have an unfair competitive advantage. So everybody has a stake in the taxpaying public in having a fair system where everyone pays their fair share. So enforcement, we think, is an important support for legitimate taxpayers and legitimate small businesses.
The gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Brad, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Koskinen. I ran on what's called the Republican Creed down in Virginia. One of the points in the creed is I promise to ensure that everyone gets equal treatment under the law. And we're a nation of laws that try to be fair to each individual. And so this is just a positive question. I know you're in a hot seat and a hot spot, but do we have a tax system that treats individuals fairly as individuals under the law?
I think we do. One of our highest commitments is to, in fact, make sure that everybody is treated fairly. As I've said, people need to feel comfortable that if they hear from us, we'll talk a little about phone scams perhaps later, but if they hear from us, it's because of something in their return. We have no interest in what party they belong to, who they voted for, what meeting they went to. The system needs to be fair in terms of its application as a policy matter, but also as for tax administration. It's critical to the system for people to feel comfortable.
That's good. And so it's at the system level, I see what you're saying. Procedurally, there's fairness. And this is, beyond, you said Treasury and the Congress, we're responsible for the tax code.
Right.
Do you think that individuals are being treated fairly that way? Kind of the Warren Buffett story, right? The different taxes different people pay depending on different, sometimes minute circumstances with vastly different tax payments. Do you think we can do a better job at creating a fair system in that sense?
Right, with my caveat that it's not our domain.
Right.
Well, usually when I say it's somebody else's responsibility, I'm about to talk to you about it.
Right.
I do think first simplification would be a great gain for everyone, including the IRS, but certainly for taxpayers and small business. I think the point that people have made is on occasion we pass tax laws and don't understand the impact of them, and so it may be a perfectly good law for a large corporation and create a lot of problems administratively or burden-wise for smaller corporations and individuals. So to that extent, I think it is important to try to understand the implication of the tax code. And as I say, what works for General Motors may not work for the corner grocer.
Gotcha. Lastly, I just received an email earlier, and I guess yesterday on the Senate side, in responses to some questions you had in the Finance Committee, someone pressed you on an issue and you replied. And let me know if this is accurate, because I want to figure this out because it has to do with fairness too under the law. What happens in these situations is someone is using a Social Security number to get a job, but they're filing their tax return with their taxpayer identification number. What that means, you said, is that they are undocumented aliens. They're paying taxes. It's in everyone's interest to have them pay the taxes they owe. As long as the information is being used only to fraudulently obtain jobs, Koskinen said, rather than to claim false tax returns, the agency has an interest in helping them. Can you help clarify that? I mean, because that's what I'm trying to get, equal treatment under the law here. If folks are here illegally, I get that you want to collect tax revenues, and I applaud that aspect, but should any agency go along with what it knows to be illegal activity?
Right. Well, our responsibility is the administration of the tax code, and it's been made clear, not everybody who has an ITIN, as it's called, is an illegal alien. They have, for some reason, they can't get a Social Security number. And so the tax code is set up, and our enforcement is that people who are earning money have an obligation to pay taxes, and we do everything we can to make sure they pay those taxes. To the extent that to get the employment, they've borrowed or somehow gotten a Social Security number, that's not a jurisdiction we have. In other words, our responsibility is to make sure they pay their taxes. We have Social Security and immigration authorities and others who enforce that part of the law. And if we start looking behind the system and doing their job for them, we're going to discourage a lot of people from paying the taxes they owe. And so, as I say, the division of responsibility is our job is to make sure people pay the taxes they owe from the earnings they've had. To the extent that they're here under circumstances that don't meet the immigration laws or don't correspond with Social Security Administration, it's really those agencies' job to pursue that.
But if you would never pursue the course if you knew you had someone engaging in illegal activity. If they were an illegal citizen, if you knew that, you wouldn't pursue trying to gather tax revenues just for the sake of pure economics over the rule of law.
No, that's exactly right. Although you will recall that the famous case of Al Capone, who was actually brought up on tax charges, not on all of his criminal activities. So ultimately, the IRS's basic responsibility is collection of taxes. We actually chase people and cooperate with justice and drug enforcement and everybody else on people who are engaged in illegal activities.
Great. Thank you. My time's expired. Thank you.
Bring going when you hear Al Capone's name mentioned. So we appreciate that. The gentlelady from California, Ms. Hahn, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Spot, Ranking Member Velasquez, for holding this hearing. Tax day certainly is fast approaching, and I can't speak for everyone here, but I know my office, particularly in my district, we get requests for help with taxes around this time every year, and we actually hold workshops to help individuals and small business owners complete their tax forms. And should come as no surprise that what I hear from people is that the tax code is too confusing, which, as you said, it's Congress's job to reform the tax code, not yours. But what's especially upsetting to me is when I hear that my constituents try to comply and reach out to the IRS to resolve their issues. They often can't even get hold of someone over the phone. It takes weeks for them to get a response in the mail, which is why they usually come to members of Congress. And this feels like it could be something that, is your responsibility and that you could really work on, because obviously involuntary mistakes for people can lead to major penalties and consequences. Additionally, many individuals and small business rely on returns to pay for their day-to-day costs and can't afford to wait. Some businesses have fewer resources and already spend more than twice as much per employee to comply with the tax code than larger firms. They deserve to receive help easily and directly from the IRS. Yet despite these trends, Congress has continued to cut funding for the IRS. And that's where I think it really doesn't make sense. So, Commissioner, I do believe, again, and I think Congress should, and it has a responsibility to simplify the tax code. At the same time, we should ensure that the IRS has the proper funding to make sure that small business owners receive the service they need to file taxes. Last year, Congress provided the IRS with an additional $290 million in funding for fighting fraud and taxpayer services. And as a result, we've seen wait times improve this tax season over previous years. However, last month, in your annual National Press Club speech, You said that only 47% of the people who call your agency this year will get through to a live person. The IRS's Small Business and Self-Employed Tax Center page provides resources, but I worry that because of the complexity of the types of taxes or of credits that small businesses may qualify for, reading and watching videos online may not be enough for many people. I want to make sure that when a small business from my district calls the business and specialty tax line, they will be able to speak to someone. So, is it possible to achieve that goal with the resources that you've been given, the goal of being that everyone in a reasonable amount of time could speak to a live person to help resolve their issues? And if not, how much funding and staff would the IRS need in order to ensure that all callers will be able to speak to a live representative in a reasonable amount of time? Is the President's request enough to make that happen? And I know we're moving to online and we're trying to get more people. There are so many people in my district that just aren't there yet. And I really would hope that we could accommodate those who still use the old-fashioned method of calling.
Well, I hope we're able to establish that with the additional funding this year, of the $290 million, we put $178 million of it into taxpayer service, and that was primarily hiring over 1,000 people in the filing season to answer the phones. So during this filing season, the level of service is at about 72 or 73%. So it's almost twice what it was during last filing season. The problem, the way we get to 47% for the year is at the end of filing season, the money's going to run out for paying for those people. And plus, we didn't have any money at the first 3 months. So the average for the year will be 47%, still a significant increase above 37% last year. But during the filing season, we marshaled all of that funding so we would actually provide as much service as we could. The President's budget for 2017 provides another 130.
And what do you consider, how many months is?
Filing season is basically January to the end of April.
Okay.
So the President's budget provides for $130 million additional for taxpayer service next year, which would get us to a level of 70% for the year. Now, in what we finally refer to as the good old days in the mid-2000s, our level of service was 80%. And we think at some point we should be. You don't want to be at 100 because then you got people sitting around waiting. But we ought to be, as we used to be, in the 80 to 85% level, and you should only spend a minute or two waiting to get an answer. But if we could get the President's 2017 budget in this area, having 70% for the year would mean we would probably be able to be at 80% during the filing season.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Gentlelady's time's expired. Gentlelady from American Samoa, Ms. Radewagen, who is the chairman of the Subcommittee on Health and Technology, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too would like to welcome you, Commissioner. This morning we heard that many small businesses self-censor and do not claim the research and experimentation or R&D tax credit, even though they may qualify for it. 2 years ago, IRS made an improvement to the regulations to allow small businesses to claim the Alternative Simplified Credit, or ASC, on an amended return. Are you aware of any other changes of this type that could be made to improve the credit's availability to small businesses?
I'm not, although we continue to look at it. I think, again, it's one of those situations where the credit itself everyone thinks is very valuable, but it's a lot easier for a large corporation to work its way through the requirements than it is for a smaller corporation. So one of the issues is whether there's a way to have a broader sort of safe harbor, much as we did with the expensing regulations and the capitalization issues, where we went from $500 to a safe harbor of $2,500. And one of the legislative proposals we have would be to allow startup costs to have, in effect, a broader safe harbor. So I think for small businesses, the answer would be to see if we couldn't get a broader safe harbor where you would be able to actually take that deduction without going through all the complications.
I see. As a follow-up, can these improvements carry over to the U.S. territories? And are you aware of any other credits that are available to the small businesses in the U.S. territories but not being utilized?
You have now gone beyond my level of expertise. I would be delighted to get back to you.
Thank you,
with an answer of how the credits apply in the territories, and are there areas where small businesses in the territories are not taking advantage of them?
Thank you. And lastly, we understand from this morning's testimony that many small businesses do not claim Section 199 domestic manufacturing deduction despite being eligible. Do you have any ideas about how to improve the compliance burden to make this benefit administratively easier to claim?
We've looked at that. In fact, one of our legislative proposals would be doing that, but we've already made some improvements in the ability to take that deduction by simplifying it actually in the last year. And so we're waiting to see how that works. But again, with the feedback we get from business groups, if they think that the changes we've made need to be improved, we'd be delighted to hear from them and take another look at it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back. Excuse me. The gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. Lawrence, is recognized for 5 minutes.
John Kessin to be here today. My questions, it's kind of twofold, but it's the same area of concern. Each year there's numerous tax scams, and many targeted small business owners because they're more vulnerable. The IRS tries to do their part by releasing the annual list of the dirty dozen, they call them, tax schemes. But I'm not sure for small business, for women-owned businesses, and those minority-owned businesses, if it's enough. To kind of tap into my next concern is that when we look at the startups and those new businesses, I just always think that there's more that we should be doing. And tell me, what is your plan or your vision to make sure that those businesses that aren't sophisticated, the startups, the minority, and the women, are getting the extra resources that they need and not just the standard list of the dirty dozen?
Well, and with regard to our outreach and advice to small businesses, we have continually, I think, improving section on the website. In fact, one newspaper recently said it was the best place for somebody to go to if they were going to start a business, because it gives you advice about how to start a business, not only what the tax implications are, but what it takes to get organized, what kinds of records you need to have, and how you should deal with the IRS. With regard to the tax scams, they continue to be a problem for us. We're most concerned at this point about phone scams, and they affect small businesses. A lot of small businesses are really individually owned. And those are threatening calls from somebody claiming to be from the IRS, saying, if you don't pay your taxes immediately, you owe money and we're going to throw you in jail, seize your business. And we have spent 2 years working with the press, working with our partners around the country, trying to get everybody to understand kind of a relatively straightforward symbol. If you're surprised to be hearing from us, you're probably not hearing from us. So if you haven't gotten a notice or you haven't got some other reason to expect a call, then it's not a call from us. The second thing we want people to understand is we would never, it's never part of our policy to threaten anyone that they'll get arrested, they'll go to jail. Anything draconian is going to happen in the next 24 hours if they don't respond. And the third most important thing is, if you're going to pay taxes, you write the check to the United States Treasury. You do not put the money in a debit card. You don't put the money in some bank account somewhere. You write a check to the United States Treasury. And I think as we keep pushing this out, if we can get more people to understand that, we will protect them. But it is a low cost of entry scam. People have phone numbers and they just robo-dial them, and then they a lot of times have a 202 area code, so it looks like it's coming from IRS headquarters. And we're concerned about it. We work with the Inspector General to track it, and our goal is to try to, in fact, protect people to the extent we can.
If I could just add this, and it kind of goes back to what my colleague said. I have numerous small business forums in my district. And when I bring in the small businesses, I have all the usual suspects there. I never had the IRS in one of my small businesses forums. And it's such a critical part of the success of a small business is knowing how to pay their taxes and having the resources. So with that being said, I will invite you to my next one.
Invite us. We would, whether I can come personally, I
know.
think you're exactly right. We should be there.
You should be
great
there.
outreach.
And to transform the position of the IRS from the person that comes to get you to the resource that you need to be successful is a challenge that I feel that we need. A lot of times people are ignorant because they're so intimidated by the IRS, because if I ask a question, they're going to come back and get me. And I think that transformation that I hear from you and that the agency is taking steps to provide information to make sure that people can reach compliance in their tax-paying responsibilities, I think we could do a better job.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And on the one hand, it's important for people to know that if you're cutting corners and trying to cheat, we're not going to be happy and we'll track you down. But on the other hand, as I said, if you're trying to be compliant, while it may take me a while to convince people we're from the IRS and we're here to help you,
Exactly.
people need to understand we really do spend a lot of time and have a lot of people dedicated to trying to make it as easy as possible for people to be compliant. And so I think you're exactly right. If we could get people to understand there are two sides of our job,
Yes.
but it's all designed to try to create a fair tax system where everybody pays what they owe. Nobody wants to pay more than they have to, but where everybody's paying everything that they ought to.
Thank you for that. And I will be calling your office.
Okay.
Thank you. The gentlelady's time's expired. Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Cabello, who is chairman of the Subcommittee on Agriculture, Energy, and Trade, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this opportunity, and thank you, Commissioner, for your testimony and for being here today. You mentioned fraud, and we discussed it extensively here. I wanted to ask you, how are you balancing this issue of suppressing fraudulent refund payments and at the same time doing your best to ensure that those valid, the overwhelming majority of refund claims, are paid expeditiously? Has this been difficult given the growing level of sophistication of some of these criminals that are presenting false claims?
It is. I think one of the things that's going to happen is that on the online authentication, to get online responses from us, you'll have to meet a higher threshold of authentication, and we expect that that means more won't get through. You'll still be able, we'll mail you transcripts, we'll mail you information, but it'll take you a few days longer. But one of the best things we've done is a year ago, as this problem continued to become more complicated, I brought together the CEOs of the major tax preparers, H&R Block, Intuit, and others, the software developers, payroll providers, and the tax administrators and commissioners from the states. And I told them that the reason for this meeting was not for me to tell them what to do. The reason was to create a real partnership between the private sector, the states, and the Internal Revenue Service to deal with fraud and identity theft and refund fraud. And it's been very successful. In fact, it's interesting to me, the most enthusiastic participants are the private sector members who went beyond asking and began to sort of request and demand that we make it permanent, which we are doing. Because what it allows us all to do, the states, the tax preparers, and the software developers and us, is exchange information in real time during the tax season, which we've done this year, which allows us to spot suspicious patterns of activity much earlier. But it also allows us to develop more and more sophisticated filters and authentication. So this year, I was told by one of the preparers, well, the IRS have to set standards. And I said, well, I'm happy to set the standards if you'll help design them, because I don't want to tell you again what to do. So this year, everyone who used software or everyone who went to a preparer had a higher level of authentication than they had last year, set by, in effect, the industry. All of the industry participants have agreed to a higher level of security. Many of them were already at that level, so we'd have a standard level of security. The states have been, we have 40 states who are cooperating with us. And so our goal is, as I told them, the reason for creating that partnership was because no one of us can solve this problem on our own. And it has been a great example of what happens if you get a public-private partnership where it's a real partnership of what you can accomplish. And so I think the most significant step forward we're going to be able to make is taking what we call the entire tax ecosystem, from the time you actually use the software or use a preparer till the time you file, and we're now working with financial institutions to the time that refund is deposited. If we can have that entire circle, sharing information, tracking down criminals, it will allow us to, in fact, let legitimate taxpayers through with more security. A big step forward, and again, I appreciate the support from Congress, is the requirement that goes into effect next year that we get W-2s at the same time the employees do. Historically, we've not gotten the W-2s until March or April, well after the time refunds go out. It will allow us to detect fraud, but also what it allows us to do is detect legitimate taxpayers. Last year, we stopped over 4 million suspicious returns out of the 150 million. Well, a chunk of those, about 1.5 million, were clearly fraudulent and were about $8 billion of refunds we stopped, but obviously a couple million were legitimate taxpayers. The W-2s earlier will allow us to authenticate taxpayers, so many of them won't be delayed very much in their refunds at all. But it's a sort of a complicated picture, but I think we're making progress.
I thank you, and I also want to commend you on really trying to change the perception and perhaps the culture of the agency, making it more approachable so that people feel comfortable knowing that the IRS is actually going to help them file their taxes as opposed to somehow get them in trouble or confuse them or discriminate against them. So I certainly do commend you for that, because as you know, many small business owners, many individual filers feel like they have to hire someone just because they don't feel the agency is approachable, just because they're paranoid, they're scared. So I certainly commend you on your work to change that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from North Carolina, Ms. Adams, who's the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Investigations, Oversight, and Regulations, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ranking Member Velasquez. And Commissioner, thank you so much for your testimony and for being here. Just have a couple of questions. You talked a little bit about scams. How do you educate companies about them and help them recover if they're victimized by that?
Well, we've been, as I say, regularly putting out notices, releases. One of the advantages of the partnership I just talked about is we now have direct access to, in effect, all the tax preparers, all of the states, so we share all of those concerns. They then publicize them. We had a big meeting last September talking about taxpayer protection and with the states and the private sector. I have been struck by the phone scams' persistence, because for the last 2 years, every press availability I've had, we've talked about. If you're surprised to be hearing from us, you're probably not hearing from us. We've had press coverage locally, nationally, across the country. We've started to arrest people, which gets some visibility. And I'm still dismayed at the number of people who actually fall for the scam. It's a declining percentage, but the Inspector General works with us and tracks it. And each week we get reports of 15,000 to 18,000 people reporting that they've gotten one of these calls. And that's just obviously the tip of the iceberg. So I think it's why we keep putting out the Dirty Dozen. We keep putting out warnings. We've been putting out warnings this year. We learned from one of our partners that one of the latest scams is what appears to be an email from the CEO of an organization goes to the payroll department and says, I need the information on our employees, their social security numbers, and it turns out that's not an email from the CEO, it's an email from a criminal.
Wow. Yeah, I get calls occasionally that the IRS says that we're having all these break-ins in my neighborhood trying to sell me, I guess, security. But thank you for your comments. So what procedures are you using to operate overall more efficiently?
Well, what we've done, especially in light of the fact that we have a lot more, we have 10 million more taxpayers and $1 billion less in funds, so we have no choice but to try to prioritize and become more effective and efficient. We're responding to the taxpayers' requests that we provide more digital services. But obviously, it's in our interest to do that as well. It costs $40 to $60 for us to answer a phone call or deal with someone in person. It costs well less than $1 to give them the same information online. So to the extent that we can be more efficient and convenient for taxpayers, it actually makes us more efficient. On the Get Transcript app that was hacked into, last filing season, over 7 million taxpayers downloaded 23 million tax returns online. Those people used to have to call. We have an app called Where's My Refund that thus far this tax season has been hit, had 250 million hits on it. Now, we don't have 250 million taxpayers. Some of them just love to push the button and find out how their refund is doing. But even if it's only 30 or 40 million taxpayers, those people used to have to call to find out the status of their returns. So to the extent that we can meet taxpayers' expectations, it also makes us more efficient.
Mm-hmm. So I do have until Monday to file my taxes.
You have until Monday. It's Emancipation Day in the district on Friday, so everybody gets until Monday.
Okay, just wanted to verify that. Okay, Mr. Chair, I'm going to yield time back.
Gentlelady, you'll back.
Yes, I do.
Okay, thank
Yes,
you,
I do.
If anybody disagrees with you when you file, just tell them you talked to the commissioner.
Gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Lukemeyer, who is Vice Chairman of the full committee, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Commissioner. A couple quick questions for you. With regards to the GAO study that was done recently, my understanding is that there were 200 recommendations that are currently open, with 11 being designated as the highest priority. Can you elaborate on that a little bit, where we are in trying to
Right, I've
find some solutions to those problems?
in my, as the chairman gave my background, I spent 3 years chairing the Intergovernmental Agency for Inspectors General. And in the private sector, I thought internal auditors were your best friends. So I'm a very strong supporter.
Somebody who's a former bank examiner and lived on the other side of the fence for 30 years. I'm not sure I go along with that, sir, but that's okay. I know where you're coming from.
Okay, so we take very seriously their recommendations, both the IG and GAO. In fact, we've counted up, we've had over 2,000 recommendations in the last 3 or 4 years from the two agencies together.
Okay, so what are we doing with them?
And so what we're doing with them is we've implemented about 80% of those 2,000. GAO has done us a great service over the last year by prioritizing them as which ones they think are the most important for us to address. Our goal is to address them all. We track them. We now have, since I've been there, we've consolidated the monitoring of those because I think it's important for us to implement them.
Can you give an example of the top 2 or 2 of the top 5?
2 of the top 5, well, they've been working with us, and in fact, we're now, one of the things is the ability to monitor our systems in real time, to monitor for...
So how are you fixing the problem?
Pardon?
So how are you fixing the problem?
So one of the things we've done is we used part of the $290 million we got this year from the Congress to acquire state-of-the-art software that allows us to increase our ability to monitor the systems in real time.
What's another one?
Another one is we've moved, pull it out of my pocket, show and tell. We have identity cards that now, instead of worrying about changing passwords every 90 days, one of the IG recommendations to make sure we did that, you can't run my computer without not only my number, but without putting this into the computer. One of the things we've been recommended to do by GAO and IG is to worry not only then about our computer operations, but about our servers and access to our servers. And again, if we get some of the additional funding in the 2017 budget, we want to move to PIV cards to access to any piece of IRS IT equipment. So you could not use a piece of IT server or otherwise without having what's called a PIV card as well as a number.
Do you have a system in place by which you are monitoring and addressing all of these with timelines on your expectation of trying to solve these problems?
Yes.
Okay. And what's the longest timeline you have, and what's the shortest timeline you have on addressing them?
Well, I'd have to take another look at it for you, but the longest
just
timeline,
roughly.
longest timeline is probably into next year, and
Okay.
that's a resource-related thing. The shortest timelines were
Okay, so we had you back a year and a half from now, all these 200, and including the high priority ones, you would hope to have them all of those addressed.
Yes, and my goal is that, again, we get, as you move down the list of priorities, we run into resource constraints, or,
Right,
we're
okay.
running a somewhat
I heard
adequate.
the resource. I get it. Quick question for you here, or just a comment to you. You know, IRS has got a perception problem with the American people with regards to how you do your job. And in my district, there's a city named Jefferson City. It's the capital city of Missouri. And there's not another office within 120 miles that's staffed by an IRS person. The Jeff City office only has one person in it. And during the time period from January 25th to February the 12th, nobody was in the office. The office, the notice on the window said that they were going off for training. That's wonderful. The staff has to be trained, but you train them in the middle of the season and then not leave the office occupied by somebody that can help. And we wrote to you about this, and you sent back a letter, which is fine, and you explained that, you can go online and get some of the questions answered, but by your own admission, over 50% of the calls don't get through.
Well, now we're up to 70% get through, but we're doing better.
Okay.
But you're right. We shouldn't train people in the middle of filing season.
It certainly has a perception problem for you. And just a quick question for you here before my time is up. There's a lot of discussion with regards to the flat tax. I realize that is a policy decision, But from the standpoint of the IRS and being able to implement a flat tax, how much would it save you from people being hired and the money being expended because of the simplification of that? Would you estimate that it would help your budget problem here that we keep addressing or going back?
I don't think I have a number for you, but clearly, if you had a 2-page form or a 1-page form where you got rid of all the deductions and everything else and people just paid, in effect, either a flat tax or a graduated flat tax, it would be simpler for taxpayers and it would be much simpler for us. We would have still, somebody's got to make sure the numbers are right and we have to follow up with people, we have to answer questions, but there'd be far fewer questions.
So if the chairman would indulge me just 1 second, what is the total budget that you have for IRS?
The total budget this year is $11.2 billion.
Okay, so can you give me a percentage of what you would anticipate saving of the 11.2 if you went to a flat tax? Have you looked at the numbers of that yet, or this?
I have not looked at the numbers.
This
That
new-
we'd save a lot. I mean,
Okay.
it clearly right
10%,
now.
20%, 30%?
I can't give you a guess, but it would be a lot. I mean, it would clearly be a sea change, a difference in the way the place operates.
Okay, I appreciate the chairman's indulgence. Thank you very much for your answers today, Mr. Commissioner. Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Hulskamp, who's the chairman of the Economic Growth, Tax, and Capital Access, and who held the hearing this morning that the commissioner testified before the committee. Is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate opportunity to ask the commissioner some questions. We had a great subcommittee hearing this morning talking about tax simplification and how by, I think, all of our 4 witnesses agreed the tax code was biased against small businesses and was obviously not helpful. And they spent a lot more per employee, per business for tax compliance than otherwise. The one question I have had for them that I direct you, Commissioner, first of all, was what in the IRS, what reassurance can we have? What process do we have that you can say, hey, small business interests are watched very closely at the IRS, and here's how we look out for small businesses rather than the large corporations who certainly have a tax code that they're able to understand and use, but not our smallest businesses across America.
Well, as I noted, we've gone out of our way to develop what has been viewed as a very positive website with as much instruction in understandable language for small businesses about how to start a business, what the obligations are, how you file your returns, how you answering as many questions, and giving them as much advice in advance as to how to actually work their way through it. We put up frequently asked questions and answers. We have tax forms for preparers. We get about 10,000 preparers every summer in which we spend, most of their clients are individuals and small businesses, and we spend time with sessions. There are 3 or 4 day sessions. We do 5 of them across the country, and we take their feedback as to what it is we should be providing to give them better information so they can better provide advice to their clients. The vast majority of small businesses use a preparer, so that's one way we can actually provide it. We continue to get feedback from business organizations and others as to where there are difficulties with forms, where there are areas where we could make improvements, because they're a significant part of the population and we take their concerns seriously.
And I appreciate that. What we heard testimony today, and it's been borne out in academic research as well, is a significantly higher tax compliance cost for our small businesses. How do we bring that down? I mean, when the tax compliance cost is 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times, I mean, there are certain tax credits, certain things they're not going to do, not going to take, that the largest corporations with, a whole assembly of tax lawyers and accountants to take care of. How do we make certain they get a fair shake in that system? I understand taking input, but at the end of the day, it's still not working for them.
No. I think, as we discussed a little earlier briefly, but let me just elaborate. I think from the standpoint of the tax code and tax laws, when we pass those, we need to pay more attention to the impact on small businesses. One of the things we've done wherever we have the regulatory authority is to increase the safe harbors so that we, in fact, allow you to take deductions or not capitalize expenses things without having to do a lot of complicated calculations, even change your accounting systems in a straightforward way. We've made some proposals, for instance, to try to standardize the definition of small businesses, because you go through the tax code and you're eligible in some places, you're not eligible in other places. It would make helpful tax simplification there if everybody knew whatever the code provision is, I'm a small business or I'm not a small business. I think if we could have more recognition of whenever a piece of legislation or a regulation even is passed, It's one thing for a large corporation, the General Motors of the world. It's another for, you know, somebody with 12 employees. And if we could bear that in mind, I think we could build more cushion into the system for small organizations.
Well, I would encourage you to continue to develop those and simplify those for our small businesses because they believe the system's loaded against them, and I think they're right. A couple things privately we visited about, Mr. Commissioner. I think about a month ago we talked about political activity definition, which Congress says no more work on that. What do you anticipate if we do not adopt language that restricts your activity on that and proceeding ahead with that redefinition political activity? What could we expect as Congress come October 1st?
Well, as I've said and talked to you, and I've talked to any number of congressmen, we wouldn't do anything that would surprise anyone. So we would continue to keep everybody advised. The Inspector General said that part of the problem is, or focus was, that the facts and circumstances and all of the examples in the regs are just too complicated. So one of the things we have made clear in our discussions with members on the Hill is that the goal isn't to change the rules of the game. The goal is to try to make them clearer. And so basically, it would try to make it easier for an organization to be comfortable when they apply for a determination, but more importantly, when they're operating, that they have a pretty good rule of the road. The rules have been made as clear as they can, and they don't have to worry about somebody looking over their shoulder after the fact, disagreeing with them because they have a different view of the facts. So the goal there would be to simplify, not make more complicated the rules, but not to change the basic fundamental way that the system has been operating since the 1950s.
And I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. Just a few more seconds, if I might, on this issue.
Gentleman's time is expired. Gentleman is given an additional minute.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And the question on this, I mean, as we've heard testimony from conservative groups, Tea Party groups, pro-Israeli groups, they thought the definition was pretty clear until about 2012, and all of a sudden it looked like they were targeted. I think there's plenty of evidence of that. One thing we did talk about, though, Mr. Commissioner, that I haven't got from you yet, you had identified to me and claimed IRS had fired over 1,000 individuals in the last year. And I wonder if you could provide that, ask that on behalf of the committee, if you provide that listing, plus how many of those had served more than a year?
Yes, I remember the temporary, and I'm sorry if we haven't gotten that back. We'll get you that answer in the next few days, because we did commit we would do that for you.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman yields back. Just had one final concluding question here, if I could. We had talked in my office about people getting those calls saying that you haven't paid your taxes, you're going to jail unless you send us money, et cetera, and how common that was. You've already addressed that I think, quite well. The other scam that I don't think we've brought up here this afternoon is how common is it that people, file their taxes and then find out that some scam artist or criminal has already filed, a bogus tax return and gotten their refund, and then the Mr. Taxpayer or Mrs. Taxpayer out there has to go through the process to prove who they are and that they didn't get it, and it was some, criminal that got it rather than them. Does that happen fairly frequently? Could you address that?
Thus far, cumulatively, we sent out about 2.7 million IP pins, which are protection pins we give to people who have been victims of it. It's 500,000 to 600,000, 700,000 taxpayers a year, which is on the one hand a small percentage of 150 million, but our sense is it's far too many in the sense that there's nothing more
you're
angst-producing.
saying 500,000 or up to 700,000 or so
Right.
that happens to each year. Now,
Right.
in the scheme of things, that might be 1 out of 300 or so if you got 150 million taxpayers.
That'd be right. But again, our view is not to minimize it. For any individual taxpayer, there's nothing more anxiety-producing than filing and discovering somebody's got your Social Security number and has filed in advance of you. So we have continued to try, as I say, to protect taxpayers from having that happen. We've also gotten much better about streamlining our process of dealing with taxpayers. In fact, increasingly, we're able to stop those returns before they get posted so that we can work the taxpayer through the legitimate filing of their return in a matter of a few weeks rather than several months, which was the system before.
And how successful have you been in actually then criminally prosecuting those individuals that have put this taxpayer in this unnecessary jeopardy?
put about 2,000 people in jail thus far. We have about 1,700 investigations underway now. Part of our problem is it started out with a lot of individuals. There are still some of those in the United States, and that's a lot of people put in jail. Increasingly, as I said, we're now dealing with organized crime syndicates around the world, and finding them and prosecuting them is obviously much more difficult. So our goal there is to simply stop them to the extent we can, or at least make it so difficult and complicated that it limits their ability to have an adverse impact on individual taxpayers. But I would stress, our concern is if we got it down to 10, it would be 10 too many, because it's a terrible thing for a taxpayer to have that happen to them.
Yeah. Well, if you want any advice from the chair of this committee, throw the book at them when you get them.
Yes, no, we do. And the courts have been good. The average sentence is about 3.5 years in jail.
Because I do think that the person who's been violated in that manner, it's probably a huge deal to them, and
Yes.
and understandably so. So they need to be protected, and we're in a position to do everything we can to try to protect them. So we appreciate your cooperation and going after those folks. So thank you very much. We appreciate your testimony here this afternoon. The Committee on Small Business remains dedicated to helping small businesses and their hardworking employees by reducing any unnecessary complexity in the tax code, and there's certainly more than ample evidence that is that complexity. And it's our responsibility, our being the members, elected representatives of the American people, because we are the ones that enact the tax code. You know, it's not your fault. You enforce it. So we need to get our act together. And it's our duty to identify these problems, call attention to them, and pursue appropriate solutions. And Commissioner, we look forward to working with you in that endeavor as we move forward. So thank you for your testimony here this afternoon. I would ask unanimous consent that members have 5 legislative days to submit statements and supporting materials for the record without objection, so ordered. And if there's no further business to come before the committee, we're adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.